I carried no empathy at the beginning, and I carry a bundle of empathy now towards people, policymakers, stakeholders, decision makers. I had a player and a set of parents come up to me and were almost petrified of going, I can't play this weekend because it's my best friend's birthday and they're having a sleepover. Is it all right if I go? And if you look at his characteristics, he's calm, he's incredibly mature, probably more mature than what his age suggests. He comes across as an incredibly, in a nice way, aggressive learner. And people will know it. When you're immersed in a system, all you understand is that system.
Yeah.
And that idea and the people that within it, and everything you do must be amazing. And I was very much in that. And coaches can get caught up in that. You know, when you only ever speak to the same coaches, you're only ever going to get the same answers.
So Dr. Noel Dempsey, welcome. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
My first question is, how did you get into coaching?
Yeah, I think I came in fairly late, to be honest. It happened in 2 phases, I'll be honest.
Okay.
First phase was after second year of my undergraduate degree. I went back to London, thought I knew everything as a second year sports science student. And my dad's friend wanted a coach to come in and work with her under 13s. I thought I was a welder. I said, yeah, not a problem, I'll do it. The session was an absolute car crash. Like, it was horrendous. And I swore that I would never get into coaching ever again. Fast forward kind of 2 years later, I came back from finishing my master's. I'm really kind of bought into me wanting to get involved in football. I was done playing. I was broken. Plus, I wasn't very good. And yeah, I just linked in with 2 coaches who'd had a really kind of great reputation of developing kind of really good players. And I basically went up and asked, look, can I come in and learn and help? And that was my gateway. And I had 2 years of effectively mentoring from 2 absolutely outstanding brothers, outstanding coaches, networkers. And they put me in a lot of great spaces to learn detail, to learn kind of systems of play, to learn individual development. And I was very, very lucky, incredibly fortunate to kind of enter that space. But that was at 21. So yeah, that was my first instance of car crash, followed by I need some help, please.
You said networking. How valuable is that in terms of your journey?
Oh, incredibly valuable. I think the nature of coaching in most industries, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Yeah.
And who you can connect with and get on with. I think it's important to understand that you can't get on with everyone. You know, we all share our own particular beliefs and values and our approach to the world. Coaching is no different. We'll all have our own styles and approaches of how we connect, how we play. And for some people it will suit, and for some people it won't. I think you've got to be prepared to understand and critique yourself, and then you'll find people who you align with. But you've also got to be quite brave to go, well, actually, I don't want to sit in a circle that always agrees with me and that I always agree with them, because otherwise you just get sucked into just being part of a particular clan, and then you don't actually know what else is going on outside.
Yeah.
But you have to get to know people. You have to get to be able to, I've always said, and I've said to, you know, the learners and upcoming coaches, that if you're going to try and gain something from someone, network and try and gain access, you need to be able to offer something. And I think that's really, really important. You need to be able to offer whether it's your time, whether it's your space, whether it's some form of expertise that you have, or just a willingness to pick up cones and pick up bibs and go and get the ball out of the bush. You know, at the beginning, you've got to be able to do that as well. It has to be a give and take, not simply a take. So yeah, that's what I would kind of introduce.
You mentioned clan, and I can imagine you mentioned networking as well, and that growth mindset of putting yourself in uncomfortable environments. Have you can you kind of reflect back on that time period and when you have had to put yourself in uncomfortable situations to grow and develop yourself in terms of the environment of coaching and career and networking and opportunity, etc.? Is there a moment that kind of sticks out?
Probably the PhD. I think more academically, but it was obviously within coaching and coach education. But I made loads of those mistakes in coaching. Like, I think I always say my whole world is just a world of mistakes. And I just slowly learn from them brick by brick. I went through phases like most young coaches do of thinking that I knew everything. And, you got this concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you know a little bit and you think you know a lot, when in reality you just don't know a lot. And that's quite indicative of certainly the influence of, I guess, media, like we're doing now. Right? You hear a snippet and you think you know everything, and you're like, no, you kind of need to do a little bit more. But yeah, I went through phases where, some really good people had to have really difficult conversations with me at times where I probably wasn't appreciative of that. To say, no, actually, I just think you're wrong. I'm not wrong. How can I possibly be wrong? But I was. I reflect back on that now, and whether it is things around practice design, whether it's things around detail, whether it was simply just my mannerisms. I'm quite a blunt person. It might just be the Southern thing, but quite clear cut to the point. And, some good, strong, authentic people turned around and went, we think you can do this much, much better. And at the time, I probably wasn't ready for that stuff. And it's only now when I look back and I go, actually, do you know what? That was a real pivotal moment. One certainly was when I was in academy football. And I argued a point that when I look back at it now, it was almost cringeworthy. And like, I was so far wrong. Like, there was no coming back. And I still argued the point, which was really just silly and naive. But you have to go through those phases. You have to go through those phases of thinking that you know a lot, to then be told that you don't and shown that you don't, to then kind of come back in and go, actually, yeah, I need to go away and learn. And the PhD was part of that. I entered the PhD space thinking that I knew a lot. And obviously, you engage with your supervisors and you realize that you know nothing.
How does one adapt then? So obviously on self-reflection, you kind of entailed this journey where you need to maybe drop ego and drop these other things and try and open your mind a little bit further to improve yourself. How does one adapt to that situation then? So there might be listeners or viewers that are watching this that kind of relate to those points that you said. Yeah. How does one adapt to actually recognize their opportunity without not knowing everything? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'll be honest, you have to have a sit down with yourself. You have to have a real honest internal dialogue with yourself and realize that you don't know a lot. I think you also have to be prepared to read, listen, speak with others that clearly do. And that's part of the networking. I guess it comes back in the sense of you have to kind of open yourself up to these people who are in industry, or they're in academia, or they're straddling both. And they're putting forward just really well-informed ideas that have been grounded in not just theory, because, the theory to practice gap is, prevalent, and things that work in practice don't always align to theory, and great theory doesn't always align well in practice. But, these well-informed people who are just able to articulate things really well beyond the superficial, beyond the surface level stuff. You want to get beyond that and just find out, the nuances of what they know. And it's for you to go away and reflect and go, can I do that? Can I actually speak about a topic at length? And I associate it now beyond 3 minutes. So we got this concept of the whole 3-minute video, these 3-minute reading article. Can you go beyond the 3 minutes? Can you actually generate some depth to your understanding, depth to your analysis, depth to your ideas? If you're saying that you've got something new, brilliant. Where does it come from? How has it evolved? How do you build on that evolvement? How do you turn it into a practical element? How do you apply it in context or different contexts? And that took time. And it took time to be able to read, to absorb, to understand or not understand. I'm still going through periods now where I'll read, literature that I read in my PhD. I'm like, I still don't fully grasp that. And you have to be honest with yourself. And I think it brings about an air of humility, because there are just so many people that know so much more. But because we always work in these kind of microsystems, very rarely do we look outside of ourselves. And I think if people can kind of be encouraged to do more of that at a deeper level over time and see it as part of a process of learning and a process of development, over time you're probably in a better space. And that relates just as much to coaching as it does to that more PhD academic journey stuff.
Yeah. How do you define a good coach? No.
One that has an impact on another person in its simplest form. And I say that broadly across a range of activities and sports, because I think a coach should be able to provide a really kind of great experience for another person, another human being, whether they be children or, adults, whether it's, disability work, whatever it may be. They should be able to leave a kind of lasting impression on those people, and make them kind of feel and think, really nice, positive things, and have that experience to make sure that people come back. I know obviously there are different contexts within that around participation, and in the context of football, development and academies, and then you have elite. But I think throughout all of that and my experiences is how can I just make people better? And that was obviously a premise of something that I wrote a long time ago, that better people make better players ultimately. So if I can help, young people, older people, just have a really good time, give them some ideas around what it means to be a good person. And we can't always be good people. We try, but we can't always be. But if you can try to always be a good person, I think then you've got the makings of a good coach, a good long-lasting coach.
Do you think those concepts are kind of missed to some extent, because there might be a focus on winning consistently or trying to achieve extrinsic things because of maybe the pressures of organisations, or you mentioned that word ego, just to look good because we're winning, especially around, like you mentioned, player development and group development, especially around maybe that social psychological factor that kind of creeps in as well. Do you think that those factors are missed in terms of maybe coaches within football?
I don't necessarily think they're missed. I don't think they're celebrated as much.
Okay.
Like I've not seen a tweet to date that has put out when a team has lost. I've never seen a tweet that's gone, "Oh, we've lost today and it was terrible and we were bad, but you know what? We had a great time and we still get on and we're going to crack on." I see it when they win a lot and when they get high scores or when they win a trophy, which is nothing. There's nothing wrong with it, but there is a balance, I think, and it's how we create that balance as coaches, which is really, really important. Systems is a different conversation because the nature of most systems is geared around objectivity, and that objectivity of winning and titles and points and money in the higher echelons of the game and of games. But I think you get more coaches now that are far more probably holistic, even at the top end. I mean, it pains me to say it, but obviously you look at Pep Guardiola and Man City and coming off the back of a famous treble win. But, Pep Guardiola is huge on taking care of them as human beings, as people. He manages the ability to be objective and win trophies as well as look after the people that are under his stewardship incredibly well. So I think it can be done, and I think he shows at the elite level, and the elite level is really easy to use as an example because there's so much exposure to it that it can be done. And I think people have fed off of that a bit. I do think at the other end, in terms of participation or the entry into sport and kind of coaching, that it needs to be highlighted that ego needs to be parked quickly, that it's not about us as coaches. We should work in the shadows, that we shouldn't, be the focal point ever. We are there to support, we're there to look after, we're there to guide, we're there to nurture. These are terminologies that I now see in coaching that they're there. I would just like it to be celebrated a little bit more, personally. I think we can do a much better job of going, do you know what, so-and-so, they didn't stop smiling today. And that's just as important as winning 2-0, 3-0, 7-0. So I'm big on the whole, let's help these little people become good little people that develop into older good little people. I say little people, but most of them are taller than me, and they're like 10. So
just on reflection of what you mentioned, and you said that you had to put yourself in positions to learn, and you said you surround yourself with people that you can grow from, and you also mentioned like academia and applying that into practice. Is there anything that kind of stands out in terms of that learning journey that was a little bit of a light bulb moment for you, just on reflection of your journey so far as a coach? Is there anything that you've picked up on and it's really maybe changed your outlook towards coaching, or changed the way that you view coaching to be?
Yeah, I think there were times and people, and I guess it comes back to the network, because these networks are people. They're people and spaces. So if I'm mentioning kind of names, I think from an academic perspective, obviously my supervisor, Dr. Colin Cronin, he's a fantastic human being, and he's an unbelievable academic. I always say he knows everything about everything. It scares me. And the first probably 12 months of my PhD were incredibly difficult, because I still had that kind of such a narrow focus of what good coaching was within a coach education strand, what was needed, and I was so heavy on the technical tactical element, and he was so patient, not to get me to change my mind, just to get me to see the whole picture, and was like, okay, but at this level, within participation, within recreation, is it important? What else? And what else is kind of big in this area? And it wasn't until you go away and you start reading that you do get those light bulb moments and go, oh, okay, I get it. So this idea of kind of holistic development, I was pretty clued up in anyway. I'd written something during my time when I worked in industry around developing better people. But when I went in and spoke to Colin, it was really almost like crystallizing moments where you go, no, I kind of have to really, if I'm really going to speak about this, I need to know how prevalent and how important technical tactical development is. And when you look at the literature, yes, it's needed. Is it the most important? Probably not. It's relationships, it's leadership, it's authenticity, it's humility in terms of good qualities of coaches and what they bring to environments as well. And that really kind of got me thinking. I'm going, wow, okay, I need to really broaden myself here and then go into some depth. Coaching wise, I think it's more, and you had him on the podcast, is obviously I'm very, very fortunate to work with kind of Jack Trainer, going into Bolton Wanderers, and just to be in Jack's presence and just listen to his calmness and his experience is wonderful. And again, if you're talking about what you have to do to learn, you have to be willing to listen with both ears and keep your mouth shut, to just be quiet and listen and absorb and almost be okay with not responding, and maybe respond in 3 days' time once you've had a real think and an idea of what was being said, what it actually means and what it means in your context and what ideas it brings to your world. And another person that did that was Keith Mayer for me. And Keith was just just a wonderful human being that gave you his time, that gave you his insights, but never pushed anything. And him and Jack were very instrumental since I moved up to Manchester. And there's a host of other people, by the way, in clubs that supported me and stuff. But if I'm thinking, retrospectively about those three people who are currently within my world, who helped me over the last kind of, decade, that they would be the three. And all three of them have very similar characteristics in terms of their humility, in terms of their calmness, in terms of not pushing their own agendas onto you. And I think that's what good people try to, they can show you why a piece of evidence might be really useful. They can show you why this story could be really impactful, but they'll never tell you that it's the way, because it might not be. Now you might have to find a different way, because we might occupy different, social spaces, different sporting spaces, different coaching contexts that might just be different. But those qualities hopefully will just generate better processes in you as a coach over time. So yeah, I think they're kind of pivotal moments, both from academic perspective, but also in industry.
Yeah.
And from a mentoring perspective, industry is probably more Jack. Mentoring wise, kind of informal, just relationship turning into friendship, certainly with Keith. And also I got to watch Keith and Jack kind of when we were working for the FA and collaborating on courses together. It was a joy to just watch and understand and try and learn.
You mentioned the element of academia and your progression into your PhD, and we'll kind of expand on your PhD in a moment. But was there an element of limited knowledge within that area, just because it's so fresh?
Yeah.
And we've got this kind of perception that we all want to be great coaches.
Yeah.
But there's actually a limitation in terms of knowledge within the field. Was that a little bit of a moment for you in terms of researching?
Yeah, I mean, I was very much I classed myself as very much behind the day I started, because, the PhD was kind of focused around coach education and coach education within football. My undergraduate degree was sports science. and my master's was in sport and exercise psychology. So now entering a more sociological space of coaching, coach education, I felt very much like an undergrad anyway. And what also probably didn't help at the beginning, but over time proved, I'll say, semi-useful, was my background in coaching and coach education was industry. So I'd obviously entered the PhD being a coach and also working for the English Football Association as a tutor, as a coach educator, whatever term you want to use, and as a mentor. So I was coaching and tutoring on these programs that I was now going to research, which gave me insight. I'm not sure it gave me knowledge. It gave me insight into the programs and into provisions, but it was very new. And the first kind of 5-6 weeks where Colin or my other supervisors, Dave or Martin, would put papers in front of me, and I'd be like, I've never seen that paper before in my life. So it was a really difficult space to navigate at the beginning because I had to learn quite quickly. Being honest, I wasn't in that headspace. Like, I was probably a really bad PhD student at the beginning, and probably just a slightly not so bad one towards the end. But that's me being honest. I don't think I was in a headspace of becoming a researcher because I was so immersed in industry. And it comes back to the clans bit, that during the time of my studies, I learned to just broaden my horizons to try and speak to everybody, to try and gain bits of information that I could apply. Whereas, and people will know it, when you're immersed in a system, all you understand is that system.
Yeah.
And that idea and the people that within it, and everything you do must be amazing. And I was very much in that. And coaches can get caught up in that. You know, when you only ever speak to the same coaches, you're only ever going to get the same answers. And I was very, very much into that. I was still quite inquisitive. I was still quite curious, but not to the level or the degree that, you know, coming out of the other end of it that I was.
I'm intrigued on that because if you're researching, you said sociological stuff, and we talked earlier before the podcast around culture.
Yeah.
If you're researching an area in terms of advancement around coach education and developing individuals and people and groups and organisations, then how does that research be implied? Because you said then that kind of changing culture and changing methods can be quite challenging with individuals. How does that transition work? How does that happen? Because you're researching it, you know all the answers, but there might be people that don't necessarily want to kind of engage with that. I'm intrigued on that process.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a case of I know all the answers. I don't think there are all the answers. I think if we take the scope of like my research within a particular governing body, within, you know, participatory coach education courses, I wanted to understand from my perspective how these courses were created. I wanted to have an idea of who came to create the content, the structure, the assessment processes, you know, why those ways. So sociologically, I had to take a deep dive into, you know, I ended up using an educational framework. So you mentioned that, you know, coach education literature is quite young still. So I turned to more education orientated literature and kind of socio-educational literature around Basil Bernstein, to just give me a bit of a framework to try and understand how people make decisions, what they make decisions on, how those decisions create, you know, policy as a text, and then how that gets disseminated. And within that dissemination, there is people that want to buy in. There are people that don't want to buy in. There's people that want to buy in but don't fully understand it. There's people that don't buy in but kind of want to have an idea. So you've got this concoction of people and places and spaces, and you have this writing on a sheet and go, I need you to, you know, align with this. And it's really difficult. You know, I've said throughout, and my research, I consider it to be fairly critical, which is what research should be, but hopefully useful as well. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that any formation of coaching and coach education is a really, really complex social endeavor to kind of journey on. And I really, I carried no empathy at the beginning, and I carry a bundle of empathy now towards people, policymakers, stakeholders, decision makers, because at some point they had to make a decision of this is going in and this is coming up. So I fully get that. I think the complexity comes when there's so many vested agendas, and that's a real concern for me, that We have all these stakeholders that are involved in coaching and coach education without really having an idea of who's responsible. So everyone wants to do all these wonderful things, but who's responsible for this, and this? Like, it's very blurred. And unfortunately, the people that suffer more often than not are the players. And that's even before the coaches. Like, I could say coaches first, but actually it's the players. And there's been some great stuff that's happened in coach education, if I'm specific around football, which is obviously my particular domain. But there's also so much more we could do that's better. But because of that complexity that goes around this creation, development, dissemination, reproduction of policies, of ideas, we're always coming out with something that probably wasn't as intended. And I'm not sure that there's many policies that aren't like that. And, people that I speak to and networking, they have very similar issues in their own sports or their own domains around policy creation and generation. And I think at some point we need to get back to actually, what do the coaches need? But in order to know what the coaches need, we need to ask. And I think as coach developers, as people who are trying to help coaches, we need to be able to ask. But also as academics, we also need to be able to ask and go, just because I know a bit, I'm going to go down this route and I'm going to write about this, when they might not care.
Yeah.
And we need to get back to that point of, what do coaches need on the ground, day in, day out, week in, week out, throughout the longevity of their season.
You said then that your work is critical. What kind of criticalities would be apparent in your work?
That it's an illumination that dissemination of policy is incredibly difficult. So I talk about coaching courses as policies, because they are created, they are written, they are disseminated before they ever enter a pedagogical space and a classroom space, or a pitch space, or a court space. And despite some really great intentions of people's ideas and people's research and reading, that there is a real need to have a real alignment, both top down and bottom up, so that the interpretation of what is created initially carries true and carries through that dissemination process. I guess the critical element of my work, if I think about a particular paper around what was intended wasn't actualized, but where it began to break down was still internally within the central creation hub. And it broke down because people simply weren't talking. And it weren't simply because they weren't talking, it was because the vast array of people and departments and timeframes and funding allocation and the requirements of aligning to frameworks, it becomes such a convoluted process that things were going to get lost, things were going to become confusing, and ultimately that's what happened on certain elements of the policy. And again, that's not me criticizing the individual people. It's probably a criticism of the wider system, of how many hoops people are required to jump through in order to get something from creation through to reproduction. It's also critical that who gets to make the decisions. So it's a very small pool of people who get to decide what becomes knowledge and what becomes prevalent on a course. We're in a mode at the moment in academia, aren't we, where there's a big drive towards this co-construction of learning. And I guess as my PhD kind of continued, it was, well, if there's these ideals of what went on in policy, and then there was some form of kind of recontextualization, some reinterpretation, and there's some confusion around it, but the idea was to co-construct, but at the same time they created content, all the content was predetermined. Where's the co-construction? And so these ideals of co-construction versus prescription is a dichotomy that shouldn't have been a dichotomy. But because of that really complex process of up, down, across these people talking, because of these other requirements, these other standards, these other regulations that had to be met, there was compromise within that. And I think my criticism around it is, how do we solve this system problem? Because it's not the individual people. These individual people do some wonderful work. How do we develop a system that enables clarity, transparency throughout? Knowing full well that it's still going to be complex, because what I class as what being good coaching might not be what you class as good coaching, and therefore we're going to have some form of compromise.
Yeah.
But if we can have something that is open enough to go, well, look, as a coach or as a tutor, I think these things are important. But in order for me to help you as the learner, as a learner coach, I kind of need to know what's coming. I need to know what it is that you think is important in your context.
Yeah.
And I think we need to do a lot more of that if we're going down the route of a truly authentic, collaborative approach to co-constructing you as a coach. I think it's used with good intentions, this co-construction. I'm just not sure policy is there with it yet. And that's not a single policy. I think there's so many that put these barriers in the way that provide, just points of struggle, we'll say.
You said ultimately the players suffer from these complexities, lack of communication. Obviously, that's filtered down, obviously, from your regard to players. Can you kind of just elaborate on what you mean by that in terms of how this might impact player development, and what kind of focus the podcast on around player development in this next phase? But
cool.
What do you mean by that, and how might that impact individuals playing the sport?
So ultimately, coaches are servants. That's what we are. We operate in a service industry. We are there to serve others. If there's no others on the football pitch, in my instance, to serve, I don't have a role.
Yeah.
And so we need to be very clear about that we are there for them. But if we're going through an education process, let's say a really linear, formal process, right? Level 1, level 2, level 3. But across those level 1, level 2, level 3, there are points of that work and that course that are confusing, that we don't buy into, that we don't kind of engage with. We're going to return to what we was doing. And if we return to what we was doing, the likelihood is it's probably not going to be very good at the beginning. And I say this because, when everybody starts coaching, they're not good coaches. They have great intentions, they might have great morals, but they learn to become a coach. But if they're not buying into content, processes, ideals, ways of assessment, then they're not going to take it on. It's going to have effectively like a washout effect. And people will just revert back to what it is that they were taught. If I did what my coaches did, we'd be running laps for half the session. And that's not good coaching. So ultimately, the players suffer because if the courses aren't offering points of reflection, these light bulb moments, opportunities to practice, opportunities to co-construct, opportunities to challenge, that then leads to people going away and really kind of giving their time to developing themselves, then ultimately the players are going to get what it is that coach got some 20 years before. Now, I'm not saying that all coaching 20 years ago was bad. There's some outstanding coaches 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. But in the main, especially within the participatory sector, where we're asking a lot of coaches who are volunteers, they are mums, dads, aunties, uncles, brothers, sisters, who are giving up their time for free to engage son, daughter, niece, nephew, or just their pals, opportunity to play, to engage, to have fun, to smile. If they're not equipped to be able to do that, then it's the players that suffer. And as I've gone through my journey, I've been far more concerned with leaving children smiling, having a good time, than I have about actually developing them into whatever you want to call them, development pathways, elite contexts, whatever you want to call them, academies.
So is knowledge king then in that process then? Is that kind of the key emphasis, knowledge? Because I think what you mentioned then, reflection and light bulb moments for the words that you said. So it's kind of applying that knowledge.
Yeah, and knowledge is a really big thing. I think we confuse knowledge, and there are obviously different forms of knowledge, but one of the things I think at the moment that coaches are struggling with is the differentiating information from knowledge. That we have an abundance of information that we are able to access. This medium, internet, videos, everything. But unless you actually take a deep dive into it and contextualize it, is it meaningful to your group in this space? Are you able to apply a particular idea and context and then reflect on that context and make it better? That's when it starts becoming knowledge. Otherwise, it's just information.
Yeah.
And, in order to do that stuff, and, part of my work, I commented around the need for coaches to be given time and space on courses with people like coach developers as well as other coaches, to give them that time, to give them that opportunity to select topics, problems that they have, whatever great practices that they have, just to showcase, to make them better, to get them to be challenged on certain things, on certain aspects of their practice and of their processes, that ultimately they can take back to their players. And that's something that I think I'm really probably developed a passion for, that, you know, I want to be able to help coaches, but ultimately I care about the little people that they're catering for, because they're going to be our future coaches and they're going to be our future citizens in the world. You know, I'm getting old and grumpy, so they're going to have to take the rein on a lot of this stuff.
In terms of player development then, so is there any, on reflection of your journey as a coach, is there anything that stands out in terms of maybe skills and mentalities in terms of an individual to make it to the top? Is there anything that kind of epitomizes an elite player and just that journey? Because it's not linear, right? There's obstacles and there's barriers and there's a small number that make it, in terms of maybe who you've maybe coached, in terms of the numbers that you've come across in the past.
Yeah.
Is there anything that stands out in terms of that process? In terms of that?
And I think we've got a concern. Do I have players that are playing in the game? Yes, but I have a million times more that aren't. So that's us as coaches, that we're always working on a really, really small percentage of success. If your success is getting people into first team, I think you have to set your own description and definition of what success is. I'm quoting the John Wooden stuff there.
Just on that, does that align with maybe coach education then, in terms of defining what success is? Does that kind of align to your point in terms of
100%.
your research?
Yeah, well, I think not so much in terms of my research, but I think in terms of the wider literature, I think we need to be really clear to coaches as they go through their pathway. And you'll get different types of coaches, by the way. You'll get career-orientated coaches, so you might be younger coaches who are, you know, fixated on wanting to get into academy football, and then they want to go into maybe non-league or management, and then completely fine, completely get it. I was definitely there when I was younger. But you know, the vast majority of coaches that are working are just coaches to cater for the participation and enjoyment of other kids and other people. And we have to kind of, in one course, you might have an abundance of those people. And you have to be very clear and honest with them to say, go on, what do you define as success throughout a session and a season, potentially? What does that look like in your context? Like, be realistic of what this means for you. Because you have to then get them to be quite humble and quite authentic and quite thoughtful quite early on. And I think that's hopefully how you get to engage them. Not everyone will be there. As you said, in terms of player development, it ain't linear. It's the same process for coaches. You know, coaches, and I think the biggest one for me before I go back is, doing the badges don't make you a better coach. They're just points in time, more for industry and more for accreditation. They don't. You know, I'm not saying that they're bad courses. What I'm saying they are very, very small snippets in a coach's journey. What goes on in between those things is far more important, in my opinion. I could be wrong. But in terms of player pathway and player development and mentalities, you've only got to look at a really recent example, right, of Jude Bellingham, who gave an absolutely outstanding interview when he obviously was unveiled at Real Madrid. And if you look at his characteristics, he's calm, he's incredibly mature, probably more mature than what his age suggests. He comes across as an incredibly, in a nice way, aggressive learner. He's very curious. He's already speaking about that he wants to learn from the likes of Modric and Kroos. So when you're talking about these characteristics, there's this willingness to go above and beyond, you know, to do the extras, to do the work, but not just on the football pitch. It's that learning and that appreciation to be able to speak, to be able to articulate yourself, to be able to be brave enough to shake someone's hand and go, as a young player, go, hi, I'm so-and-so. What am I going to learn today? To be able to question and challenge, which for a lot of kids is incredibly difficult, and that's other systems problems. You know, if you look at education and the way they structure their system is very content, it's not process. We're asking these kids in football to develop a process that is so far beyond probably their age. It's incredibly tough. Like, we're asking them to be good people. We're asking them to be good decision makers. We're asking them to be good judgment makers. We're asking them to be good teammates. We're asking them to be fit. We're asking them to be technically proficient. We're asking so much of these young kids. It's scary. And that's why it's so difficult. It's why it's so complex. It's why some people fall down, and that's fine. You know, not everyone's destined to be a top elite player. But if you are looking at those qualities, they're the qualities that I think you have to carry. You have to carry that willingness. You have to carry that curiosity. You have to carry that mentality to always be willing to listen, you know, and learn and absorb, while also being yourself. You know, while also kind of trying to develop your own identity and your own identity as a human being, because it may just be that you won't be good enough.
Yeah.
And, you know, one thing that we do need to continue in football is to get them to understand who they are as people, rather than, oh, you're Christy, the football player. Everyone knows who you are. They've seen all your videos about you and you're amazing. You drop out and there's no more videos of you on the pitch. Who are you?
Yeah.
And I think that, unfortunately, is the story that comes out of football every single season.
Yeah.
Certainly within the academy journey, that we see the successes. They're easy. They're exposed. We see them on Sky Sports News. We see them on, you know, podcasts. We see them. But, you know, those people are also developing themselves as human beings, as people. And I think that's probably the avenue that we need to keep focusing on. Coaches will take care. You know, there's some wonderful coaches that work in the academy system and throughout football. They all deal with a lot of the stuff in football, and some really top coaches will also look after the people. But it's the responsibility of parents, guardians, carers to keep, you know, their kids grounded, to, you know, to value things like education, to value things like just being a good person, you know, socially, emotionally. Because ultimately, at some point, they're going to have to navigate another world. You know, the football world may stop at some point, whether it's after a year or a 20-year career. They've still got to navigate different spaces, and you know, you've got to be, I guess, a lot more wholesome in that space and in those moments to do that.
Do you think more needs to be done in that area then, from an ethical point of view? You mentioned all those characteristics that are layered on top of an individual within a professional academy environment, and you mentioned that transition around identity and how that can impact an individual in terms of well-being, etc.
Yeah.
There's been a big emphasis on player care recently.
Yeah.
Colleagues that we work with have emphasised that.
Yeah.
From your own point of view, so from a coach and a leadership point of view, you have to obviously deliver sessions, make sure they're developing themselves in terms of maybe that four-corner model that we kind of touched upon. From maybe an ethical point of view then, can more be done? Because I'm intrigued on that process, because there's only so much you can do.
Cool. And
you mentioned the reliability of parents and guardians as well, and maybe educating them as well. I'm intrigued on that process.
Yeah, I think we do need to see the education of parents being just as integral as the development of players while they're in a particular system. So let's say an academy, for example. And I think there does need to be that continuous dialogue, but also that continuous, I guess, whether it's a refresher or just introducing them to new things around, you know, self-care, care for the child, but also care for the parents. You know, we often forget the sacrifice that parents go through for their children in terms of taking them, you know, all over the country 2-3 times a week. Like, you know, I'm a parent myself, and, you know, luckily my kids are still quite young, so I'm not doing that stuff yet. But, you know, it's a massive commitment. So I think we need to give back to the parents as well. To be able to kind of do that. I think, yeah, you know, that we have obviously now in football the player care position through the EPPP, and previously that was kind of head of safeguarding and kind of head of education did a bit of that. And during my time of head of education, you know, I found myself absorbed in a kind of mentoring role at different times with the players who were obviously full-time. But I think it needs to be a collective process. It's a really tough one, because as the game, and this is where other things influence, right? The money, the objectivity of titles and wins and caps and medals, you know, they're great for the select few. I wonder how many coaches and you know, heads of coaching and academy managers and 21s coaches are happy for a player not to come to training today because it's their birthday. I remember a distinct example, and I use it in one of my modules, where I had a player and a set of parents come up to me and were almost petrified of going, I can't play this weekend because it's my best friend's birthday and they're having a sleepover. Is it all right if I go? And the parent then came up to me afterwards and said, look, what we've said is we've agreed that they can go to the sleepover. But what we'll do though is we'll pick them up in the morning from the sleepover and we'll bring them to the game. I'm like, it's just not realistic.
Yeah.
Like, you have to have these experiences of being with your friends.
Yeah.
Like, it's part of who you are. And I just said to the parents, stop. Of course he can go. It's not even a question. You should be saying to me, no, he ain't coming to the game this week because he's really looking forward to this party. Because that's just as important for that child's development as it is playing, 60 minutes of a 90-minute game, because of the equal minutes approach. Because, and I was just like, tell me what your kid would do. I said, they're going to go to bed at 4 in the morning, messing about with all their mates. You're going to pick them up at 7. You've got a 90-minute travel to a game. Who's then going to play for an hour. And then you've got to travel an hour and a half back. I said, it doesn't make sense, does it? Doesn't make sense. Go and have fun. Please go and play. Go and play with your friends. Go and enjoy your sleepover. Not sleeping is what you do, right? You go to a sleepover and no one sleeps. I'd like
Follow up this way a little bit. That's it.
that better.
Yeah.
I'd like that to be more prevalent. I'd like us to look after those kids more. And I'm not saying that every kid is that. There might be kids that are just absolutely driven, that love being in 4 or 5 times a week. Fine. But there might be kids that are doing really well, but actually are missing their basketball team, or they're missing just being with their friends.
Yeah.
And throughout their journey and throughout their season, it's, look, you seem quite down at the moment. Like, what's up? I haven't seen my friends. I miss this part. Do us a massive favour. Don't want to see you for 2 weeks. Don't want to see you for a month. Come back when you're ready. Don't worry about it. Because we know that the development of these people isn't linear. If they miss 2 weeks, they're not all of a sudden not going to make it because of those 2 weeks. Kids get injured. They're out for 6 months. Do you know what I mean? And they come back and they're okay. They get back into the... So I think there needs to be that more broader scope of what these children are potentially missing out on. And I'm not saying that all of a sudden football becomes secondary all of the time, because there is a level of commitment that you have to show in yourself as well to football clubs. I get that. But I do think there needs to be a balance. I think there needs to be that idea of how you balance that kid's journey as a child, as a kid, as a human being, rather than Christy the footballer.
Is this a common theme within England? Obviously, we're looking at it from maybe a UK lens, but in terms of maybe Europe and where football is played elsewhere and development of individuals in other countries, obviously there's a tendency over the last 20 years for us as English coaches and English fans to admire other countries in Europe and across the world. Is there anything different, or is there any kind of stands out on maybe your research or maybe your experience that's kind of different in other countries to look after young people, but also to develop outstanding individuals that can represent football clubs and international countries at the world stage?
Yeah.
I'm just interested in that.
I think we've come a long way. I think I sit on the fence with the EPPP. I talk about it as a really large system, and it gets bigger. It keeps getting bigger. And I'm not sure bigger system means more. More doesn't necessarily mean better. More just means more. And I have this argument all the time around talent identification, that we have academies and we have pre-academies and we have pre-academies, of which I'm part of that system, by the way. So we have an influx of more, but I'm not sure that we're any better at identifying talent. If we were genuinely better at identifying and developing, we wouldn't need a huge system. We just need a really good system. But on the flip side, EPPP do some brilliant stuff. The nature of games program, the categories also helps in terms of resource and what they're able to do. Their own pedagogical approaches. And I do think we've borrowed, but I do think EPPP and individual clubs have made it their own in the UK. I did a study visit a number of years ago to Holland, and I spent some time at 2 clubs over in Holland. And what's interesting is that a lot of the changes that sometimes try and get adopted here don't work because they're cultural rather than actual systematic and sport specific. So there was instances where one club linked with, I think, the 7 or 8 schools where the majority of players were coming, and they made their week more balanced between football and schooling. Now, this happens at category 1s from a certain age group, but it doesn't happen at category 3s in this country. So it's reserved for the top tier. So the top tier might do that blendedness of learning and in terms of an education setting and football setting far better than category 3, but that's from a resource perspective, that's from money, that's not from an intention, that's not from ideas. And, you know, there's some great cat 3 clubs who do it, you know, really well and are quite innovative with how they kind of combine education and coaching where they can. So I don't necessarily think that, you know, we look outwards to then try and just adopt. I think EPPP and Premier League, EFL and the individual clubs have done some really astute work more broadly from what I know and from what I speak to people about and what I read. And I think the EPPP is somewhat in a good place to a certain point. I just think culturally we do have barriers. You know, we do have barriers. You know, that you don't see the blendedness of sport, physical activity embedded into education as much now. And that's from wider government agendas towards more, let's say, traditional curricular approach to subjects and ideas. And that has an impact. It has a massive impact on sport.
But it also has an impact on female participation as well, and an element within that.
100%. And this tradition that, again, I don't want to, you know, this whole traditional stuff and these ideals. When I talk about these policy things, these are the things that sometimes get in the way. This bureaucracy of preventing people and, you know, maintaining inequalities that the vast majority of population, you know, of this society in the UK will turn and go, how is this even happening? Why does this make sense? Why are we still doing this stuff? But there are just certain people, places, agendas that put stops to that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And you're speaking about it more widely in terms of, you know, whether it's gender inequalities or obviously a spectrum of what it is. You know, I think we have to be more attuned to that type of stuff now. It's all complex.
So back to the coaching, and we'll kind of see the podcast out in terms of coaching and where you see it going. But for anyone that's watching or listening to this podcast, they might be a coach or an inspiring coach in football, or it could be other sports. What advice would you maybe give to them in terms of to being successful within the industry? Because you've obviously studied the educational policy side of it. You've experiences within football clubs. You mentioned leadership management and all the micro politics that come with getting to a higher end within the sport. Is there any advice? Is there anything that kind of stands out for you, for listeners or viewers?
Yeah, I think for me, it's personally, it's, you know, don't see you being a coach as something separate to who you are. I think the best coaches are the most authentic coaches. I think, you know, and you have to go through that process, by the way. Yeah. I don't think, you know, especially young aspiring coaches necessarily know who they are. And I can say that from experience. You know, I can say that personally. I'm not saying that everyone won't know who they are, but I certainly didn't. You know, my values were skewed and I had different beliefs and they changed, and they always will. But you'll come to a point in your life where you'll go, no, do you know what? I have a genuine love and care for this type of thing and this approach. And you'll find your own ways into that. But I think if you can start your journey with the idea that you just want to make you better, you know, then you're going to always kind of have that idea and process in mind. And I think the other piece of advice is don't rush anything, which is really difficult. And I get it, because right at the start you mentioned, you know, this nature of getting into clubs and getting this and winning titles and doing that. And, you know, we perceive it as being quite a short time frame, and people get celebrated for flying through their badges and you go, brilliant. But to learn deeply, to learn more thoughtfully about who you are, about the nature of the game or the sport or the activity, you have to immerse yourself in it. You have to immerse yourself with literature. You have to immerse yourself with videos, with podcasts, with people. You have to be willing to, you've got to go and get your boots dirty. In the case of football, you have to go and coach, and you have to be brave in your coaching to try stuff that is outside of your experiences, outside of your norms. And that might simply be a different practice design. It might be that you're used to shouting a lot, and that's definitely me, to saying absolutely nothing, to saying nothing at all. And that's really hard. But you've got to see it as a longer kind of development process. If you don't, and all you're concerned with is the objective of level 1, then level 2, then B license, then A license, development center, academy, you'll probably make and burn more bridges and make more enemies than what you gain in terms of good people, because you're trying to be a role rather than just be a good person.
Comes back to that point around ego and status as well, I presume.
Yeah, and listen, you've got to have a bit of ego about you. You've got to know that you're good at stuff.
Yeah.
You can't just
of course
park it. But I think you need to kind of understand that there's very, very few. I talk about trend followers and trendsetters. The vast majority of us are trend followers. I certainly am. Right? There are very, very few trendsetters in the world. Please, please, please aspire to be a trendsetter. Right? But accept the fact that there are some phenomenal human beings in this world. Pep Guardiola in this immediacy, who every single one of us has absorbed his coaching philosophy in some way, shape or form. Whether it's his playing style, whether it's just a simple thing of inverted fullbacks, whether it's, caring about the people, whatever it is, we've taken snippets of Pep Guardiola and others. But, seeing as they're most prevalent, they're on TV at the moment, that would be a decent example. But ultimately, we've got to have the humility that most of us follow trends. But if you can follow a trend knowing that you've thought deeply about it, that you've thought about how it relates to your sets of players in your context, and that ultimately it helps those players and people have a good time, smile and learn, that's success. And as you go through your journey, you might have to redefine success and what that looks like to you. Fine. I would just try and say never at the compromise of who you are as a person.
Yeah.
So that would be my main one.
So final question, Noel.
Yeah.
What I tend to do is reflect back and look forward. And I think it'd be nice just to see where you go with this in terms of your research and your profile and your practitioner role and kind of all these different elements into one.
Yeah.
If you were to maybe see yourself at the end of your kind of coaching career and kind of seeing yourself and putting your feet up and relaxing and leaving maybe a little bit of a legacy, is there anything that you have in mind going forward that you want to try and achieve? Is there anything that stands out for you in terms of the area of coaching that you want to maybe achieve and kind of look back and reflect on and go, that's what I was meant to do in terms of this area?
Yeah, I think in its simplest form, I want to be someone that can help. In its simplest form, I think my research journey has kind of led me to now post PhD where I'm like, oh, what do I do? And I'm really interested in systems. So I'm interested in the wider systems that create opportunities for learning. And I'd like to have an influence, big or small, in being able to create a better educational system for coaches in this country, whether it be football or other sports or a combination of. There's outputs that I have from my research that I'm currently exploring around frameworks and reflective tools and stuff that I want to hopefully engage people with and see if they help. But ultimately, I just want to be someone who people could come to and go, could you answer this question, or what do you think? And I could give them my time and give them my space to go, I think this. We know in this world that we can't do that with everyone, otherwise we never get time to do our own stuff. But I'd like to think that anyone that asked what was he like 50 years ago, that he was, as well as being blunt, being helpful. I think that would hopefully be a legacy of just being critically helpful. I'm not sure. Yeah, that would probably be it.
For those listening or watching and they want to contact you now, where can they find you on social media? Is there anything that you use?
I'm on Twitter. I use Twitter. Twitter is a great networking tool, and it's also great for kind of research and ideas to start your thinking. So I'm on Twitter. I don't know my handle, so
we'll put the handle in the description.
Yeah. I've been on it for so long, I don't remember it. And then the other one's kind of obviously LinkedIn. If you just type my name into LinkedIn, I'm pretty much accept everyone because I'm like, oh, I wonder if they've got a question. So yeah, they can always grab me on that, and obviously, university email, which is just ndempsey@ucfb.ac.uk. Always happy to kind of get an email and stuff like that, and yeah, just reach out and critique this. Is it helpful? Is it not? Why is it? Why isn't it? I'm very open. I try not to I don't take things personally. I take them professionally, and if critiques make me better, then that's good. And yeah.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Noel Dempsey, thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers will enjoy it as well. Just want to thank you for your time, and good luck in the future.
No, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Top man.
Cheers.